The Middle Ages were never just an age of darkness. They were an age of fear, fear of the unknown, fear of the invisible, fear of being different. From charms to witch hunts, from whispered prayers to public executions, every act of superstition came from the same wound, the human need to explain what cannot be understood. And when knowledge failed, fear filled the space it left behind. They believed crosses could stop storms, that salt could block evil, that a single wrong glance could kill. But behind those beliefs was something universal, the terror of being powerless. We look back and call them ignorant, but their fears weren't so different from ours. We still chase comfort in rituals, still create monsters out of what we don't understand. Only now, they hide behind screens instead of shadows. In the end, superstition never disappeared. It simply changed its language. Because fear doesn't need proof to survive. It only needs believers. And what made it worse was how unpredictable it all felt. You could follow every rule, say every prayer, carry every charm, and still lose everything. So the fear grew. It became the air people breathed. Silent, invisible, inescapable. To survive, they needed protection. Not from what they could see, but from what they couldn't. And that's how it began. The rise of everyday magic. Simple gestures, strange objects, little fragments of comfort in a world ruled by terror. When fear becomes unbearable, people look for control. In the Middle Ages, control came in the form of small rituals, gestures so simple yet filled with desperate hope. They called it protection. We would call it superstition. A farmer would never start his day without whispering a blessing to his tools. Before milking a cow, he'd draw the sign of the cross in the air. If thunder echoed across the hills, families rushed to light candles, believing their glow could keep lightning and demons away. The world felt fragile, and every movement had to be careful, deliberate, sacred. Inside every home, objects became shields. A pouch of herbs hanging from the ceiling kept away evil spirits. A horseshoe nailed above the door protected the family from misfortune. Salt on the table symbolized purity. Spilling it meant inviting chaos. Even iron, cold and heavy, was seen as holy, forged by fire and untouchable by darkness. Mothers tied red ribbons around their children's wrists to confuse witches who tried to curse them. Travelers carried bits of bone or teeth carved into crosses. Everywhere, people surrounded themselves with meaning, a private army of little charms against the unseen. But protection came with rules. You couldn't leave a broom standing upright. It invited wandering souls. You couldn't whistle indoors. It summoned the devil. And if you met someone with mismatched eyes, you made the sign of the cross before greeting them. Better to offend a person than attract a curse. These rituals gave people something real to hold on to when the rest of the world made no sense. When a fever spread through the village, they burned rosemary and sage to cleanse the air. When animals died suddenly, they buried them at crossroads, hoping the spirits would lose their way and not find the village again. Every superstition was a map of survival, drawn in fear and faith. To us, these gestures seem absurd, but to them, they were anchors, proof that they could still do something, anything, against the chaos closing in. And yet, the more they relied on these small acts of protection, the more their fears deepened. Because what happens when the magic fails? When the prayers don't work? That's when people start looking for someone to blame. For medieval people, the body wasn't flesh and bone. It was a fragile vessel caught between heaven and hell. If it broke, it wasn't sickness, it was punishment. And if it healed, it was a miracle. When a fever struck, people didn't ask what caused it. They asked who. Was it a curse? A demon? A jealous neighbor? Illness was never random. It was always someone's fault. Doctors, priests, and healers all fought for the same thing: control over the invisible forces inside the body. The church offered prayers. Doctors offered rituals disguised as medicine. And both claimed authority over life and death. They believed the body contained four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. If one overflowed, madness, weakness, or sin followed. To restore balance, physicians used knives and leeches to drain the bad fluids. People would leave the doctor pale and dizzy, convinced that losing blood meant losing evil. Others sought stranger cures. Some swallowed crushed gemstones to cool the soul. Others rubbed animal fat on their wounds or wore charms made from dried hearts. Anything that seemed holy, rare, or painful had power. Even the smell of burnt hair or the ashes of a bird were used to drive sickness away. The line between medicine and magic barely existed. Barbers and monks worked side by side, one cutting hair, the other cutting flesh. Every remedy came with a prayer, every incision with a whispered spell. It wasn't science. It was survival wrapped in ritual. And then came the plague. No cure, no pattern, no mercy. People filled the streets carrying torches and flowers, convinced the smoke would keep away the death in the air. They rang church bells to scare the disease. Some whipped their own backs, hoping pain would cleanse sin. Others blamed the stars or themselves. The body had become a battlefield, not between sickness and health, but between faith and fear. Every fever felt like a test. Every cough sounded like a warning. They couldn't see the cause, so they fought the symptoms with everything they had: herbs, prayers, iron, pain. And when nothing worked, they turned on each other, because it was easier to burn a witch than to face the truth. No one was in control. By the late Middle Ages, fear had taken on a face, and that face belonged to the devil. He wasn't a distant figure from sermons anymore. He was everywhere, in the fields, in the wind, in the eyes of your neighbor. People saw signs of him in everything they couldn't explain. A harvest spoiled overnight, the devil's hand, a storm destroying a church, his revenge, a child born with a deformity, a mark of sin. There was no longer such a thing as coincidence, only corruption. Animals became his messengers. Black cats were witches in disguise. Owls were omens of death. Crows circling above a house meant a soul was about to die. Even simple creatures like frogs or snakes were seen as proof that the devil walked among them. Objects, too, carried danger. Mirrors were feared for trapping souls. Shoes placed upside down could summon spirits. A candle that blew out on its own was said to mean a demon had entered the room. No gesture was harmless. No noise was meaningless. And for those who truly believed, the devil didn't just tempt. He invaded. Stories spread of possession, of men and women speaking in strange tongues, twisting in pain, clawing at their own skin. Exorcisms became public spectacles. Priests shouted prayers, crowds gathered, and the possessed became living proof that evil could live inside anyone. The obsession grew. People started seeing witchcraft behind every tragedy. If your bread failed to rise, if your child cried at night, if your husband strayed, there was always someone to blame. The old, the poor, the midwives, the widows, all became targets. The church, once the guardian of faith, became the judge of fear. Every village had its own stories, tales of shadows that whispered, of beasts that howled like men, of women who could curse with a glance. And each story fed the next until fear became tradition. The devil didn't need to appear. He only needed to be believed in. Because once fear is shared, it doesn't need proof. It becomes truth. And that truth would soon spill into fire, accusation, and blood. Because the next step after fear is punishment. It starts with a rumor and ends with a verdict. By the late Middle Ages, fear no longer whispered in kitchens. It sat in council rooms. Superstition turned into policy, and belief wrote the rules. Priests, magistrates, and lords gathered to decide which invisible crimes were real and who would pay for them. Accusation came first. A neighbor swore she saw candles burn backward. A child pointed at a midwife. A cow died, bread failed. A storm cracked the steeple. Proof enough. Names were collected like kindling. Then came the search. Homes were stripped. Books, herbs, dolls of wax, iron nails bent into crosses, jars of ash. Everything became evidence. Bodies were inspected for witch marks. moles or scars that pain did not stir. Silence counted against you. So did tears. Interrogation followed. Some confessed from terror, others were broken by it. Sleep was taken away. Ropes bit into wrists. Cold water trials were staged. If you floated, the water rejected you. If you sank, you were innocent and drowning. Hot iron decided guilt, too. If the wound healed cleanly, God had spoken. The logic was perfect because it could never be wrong. Trials felt like ceremonies. The courtroom smelled of wax and wet wool. A priest read charges. Witnesses repeated rumors until they hardened into facts. The verdict was known before the words were spoken. Guilt became a ritual the town performed on itself. Punishment did not only remove a body, it purified a community. Stocks humiliated, lashes warned, fire erased. At the edge of town, wood stacked high, the crowd pressed forward in a fever of certainty. Children watched because they had to learn what danger looked like. Different, poor, old, silent. Old, not every place burned. Some fined, some banished. But everywhere fear became a habit. It organized markets, marriages, councils. It taught people where to stand and when to speak. It made survival a performance. And yet, for all the loud justice, the quiet truth remained. Superstition solved nothing. Fields still failed. Plague still came. The wind still rose at night. What it did do was give shape to panic. It offered a script for grief. It turned accidents into enemies and neighbors into threats. It promised control at the exact moment control was impossible. That is when belief becomes law, when fear needs paperwork, seals, and witnesses, when a shadow earns a signature, when a community convinces itself that punishment is protection. The fire dies down, the crowd scatters. Ash settles like gray snow on the road home. Tomorrow the wind will rise again, and the church bells keep ringing. The Middle Ages were never just an age of darkness. They were an age of fear. Fear of the unknown. Fear of the invisible. Fear of being different. From charms to witch hunts, from whispered prayers to public executions, every act of superstition came from the same wound. The human need to explain what cannot be understood. And when knowledge failed, fear filled the space it left behind. They believed crosses could stop storms, that salt could block evil, that a single wrong glance could kill. But behind those beliefs was something universal, the terror of being powerless. We look back and call them ignorant, but their fears weren't so different from ours. We still chase comfort in rituals, still create monsters out of what we don't understand. Only now they hide behind screens instead of shadows. In the end, superstition never disappeared. It simply changed its language. Because fear doesn't need proof to survive. It only needs believers.